back in 1536, something absolutely massive kicked off in the north of England. We're talking about the single largest rebellion in all of Tudor history. Now, this wasn't just, a few angry farmers with pitchforks. Oh, no. This was a full-blown crisis that genuinely shook King Henry VIII's throne to its very core. So let's dive into this thing called the Pilgrimage of Grace and try to figure out what could possibly drive a whole kingdom to rebel. Okay, to really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number, 30,000. That's how many people, 30,000, took up arms against their own king. I mean, think about that. This was a colossal army, way bigger than anything Henry could pull together quickly to stop them. For a while there, the entire north of England was pretty much in the hands of the rebels. And here's what's so fascinating. Who made up this army? You might think it was just, angry peasants, right? Nope. It was this totally shocking alliance. You had regular folks, commoners, marching right alongside local knights and gentry, the landowners. And get this, even priests and monks joined in. All of them marching together under one banner. It's just wild. So, what on earth could unite all these completely different social classes? I mean, what gets a priest and a farmer and a local lord to all agree on something so dangerous? Was it about God? Was it about politics? Or was it, just about money? Let's break it all down. Okay, so the first and maybe the most powerful argument you'll hear is that this was all about religion. That at its heart, this was a desperate last stand for the old Catholic faith against the king's, his radical new ideas. You really have to appreciate the sheer speed of this change. I mean, we're talking about just a couple of years, and England's entire religious landscape gets turned completely upside down. First, you get the Act of Supremacy in 1534. Suddenly, the king is the head of the church, not the pope. Then, boom, in the summer of 36, right before the rebellion kicks off, the government starts shutting down the smaller monasteries. And on top of that, they issue new rules that basically attack beliefs people have held for centuries. For the average person whose entire life revolved around the church calendar, this must have felt like a terrifyingly fast, out-of-control revolution. And this really shows you the clash of worlds we're talking about. On one hand, you have the world they knew, praying to saints, going on pilgrimages, celebrating all the familiar holy days. The monasteries, they weren't just stone buildings. They were the heart of the community, spiritual centers, but also a source of charity, even a major local employer. Then, on the other hand, you have this stark new reality where all of that, everything they knew, was being torn down or called superstitious. It's a huge shock to the system. The historian Eamon Duffy, he just frames this perfectly. He argues that the rebellion was, and I'm paraphrasing here, a massive reaction from the ground up. It wasn't about complicated theology for most people. No, it was about defending an entire way of life, a world filled with familiar rituals and a strong sense of community that they felt was literally being stolen right out from under them. And if you look at what the rebels actually did, the evidence for a religious cause is pretty compelling. I mean, one of the very first things they did was march to Solly Abbey and put the monks back in. They didn't even call it a rebellion, right? They called it a pilgrimage. And the banners they carried, they showed the 5 wounds of Christ, which is a super powerful Catholic symbol. All of these actions just scream that faith was front and center. But that's not the whole story. There's another angle. Some historians, like the very influential G.R. Elton, had a different take. He argued that all this religious anger from the common people was actually being manipulated, that it was being used by powerful people at the top. So maybe this was less about prayer and more about politics. At the heart of this whole political theory is this group called the Aragonese faction. Basically, these were powerful nobles who were still loyal to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. After Henry divorced her, they lost a lot of power and influence at court. These guys were conservatives, and they absolutely hated the new direction the country was going in, especially the rise of guys like Thomas Cromwell, the king's top minister. So, the argument basically goes like this, step by step. Henry divorces Catherine. Princess Mary gets kicked out of the line of succession. This whole conservative faction gets pushed to the sidelines. And then, according to this theory, they look at all this religious anger brewing among the common people, and they see an opportunity. They see it as the perfect tool, a weapon they can use to stir up a massive crisis, force the king to get rid of Cromwell, and, get themselves back in power. But, there's a potential problem with this political view. We have to remember that after the rebellion was crushed, the government was looking for people to blame, and it was pretty convenient to point the finger at a few high-profile lords, right? So you have to ask, Was this idea of a court conspiracy just a handy piece of government propaganda? A way to avoid admitting that tens of thousands of ordinary people absolutely hated the king's policies? It's a really important question. Okay, that brings us to our third major theory. This one is championed by historians like Andy Wood, and it shifts the focus away from God in the royal court and onto something much more basic: people's wallets. The socio-economic argument suggests this rebellion was really just a cry of desperation from the poor and hungry. You have to understand, the north of England was already a much poorer region than the south. Now, on top of that, you've got bad harvests, which means people are starving. You have landlords doing things like rack renting, just jacking up the rent, and enclosures where they'd fence off common land that poor villagers absolutely depended on to graze their animals. And then rumors start swirling about a whole bunch of new crippling taxes on everything from cattle to baptisms. This isn't just about being annoyed anymore. This is about survival. And shutting down the monasteries, man, that just poured fuel on this fire. It caused this huge social shift. The king took all that land and gave it to a new group of nobles, basically to buy their support. Well, that squeezed out the old local gentry, and even worse, it completely cut off the common people from the charity and the help the monasteries had always provided. It's a classic story. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were getting a whole lot poorer. All right, so we've got three really compelling theories, right? Religion, politics, and the economy. So how do we figure out which one is the real reason? Well, maybe the best way is to stop listening to historians for a second and start listening to the rebels themselves. See, the most valuable piece of evidence we have is the actual list of demands the rebel leaders wrote down. They weren't just a disorganized mob. They had a clear agenda. They knew what they wanted. And if we look closely at that list, we can get right to the heart of what was really driving them. And when we actually look at their official demands, the Pontefract Articles, the answer just becomes crystal clear. It's all right there. Look, they demand an end to heresies. That's religion. They demand the punishment of Thomas Cromwell. That's politics. And they demand that the enclosures be pulled down. That's a direct socio-economic issue. It's all there, in their own words. Bam, bam, bam. So what's the big takeaway here? It was never just one thing. It's not that any of these historical arguments are wrong. It's just that on their own, they're incomplete. They're only part of the puzzle. The truth is, the Pilgrimage of Grace was a perfect storm. It was this powerful, explosive mix. You had the genuine religious devotion of the common people, which was then fueled by their absolute economic desperation. And that whole raging fire was then cleverly guided by some of those disgruntled nobles who saw a chance to get back into power. Each cause just fed into the others, making the whole thing bigger and more dangerous. And that really leaves us with a big, powerful question to think about. The Pilgrimage of Grace shows us what happens when people feel that everything, and I mean everything, that they hold dear is under attack all at the same time. Their faith, their ability to feed their families, their entire identity. So when that happens, is rebellion not just possible, but maybe inevitable?